The morning sun cast long shadows across the firing range at Fort Harrison as I gripped what everyone assumed was a piece of junk. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez had just handed me a rifle that looked like it had been through a blender, its stock cracked, scope mount loose, and trigger mechanism making sounds that would make any weapons expert cringe. What he didn't know was that I'd been fixing broken things my entire life, and this wasn't just about proving I could shoot, it was about proving I belonged. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Chen, and 6 months ago I thought landing a civilian contractor position as a marksmanship instructor at Fort Harrison would be the fresh start I needed. After 6 years as a Marine Corps shooting instructor at Camp Pendleton, I was ready for something different. The transition from active duty to civilian life hadn't been smooth. My younger sister Emma was starting her junior year at Colorado State, and between her tuition payments and my own student loans from my engineering degree, the contractor salary at Fort Harrison was exactly what I needed to keep us both afloat. Fort Harrison sits nestled in the Colorado Rockies, about an hour outside Denver, and serves as one of the Army's premier training facilities. The base specializes in advanced marksmanship and tactical training for both new recruits and seasoned soldiers preparing for specialized assignment. When I first drove through those gates in early spring, the mountain backdrop made everything feel like a new beginning. I'd grown up in San Diego, spent my Marine years in California, and Colorado represented a complete change of scenery and mindset. The job posting had been straightforward enough. They needed experienced instructors to help implement a new federal training program designed to improve overall marksmanship scores across all branches. The program emphasized adaptive shooting techniques and unconventional training methods, exactly the kind of innovative approach I'd been developing during my final years in the Corps. My resume spoke for itself, consistently ranked in the top 5% of Marine marksmanship instructors, multiple commendations for training excellence, and a reputation for taking struggling shooters and turning them into marksmen. What I didn't anticipate was walking into a situation where my Marine background would be seen as a liability rather than an asset. The Army has always had a complex relationship with other branches, and Fort Harrison was old-school Army through and through. Most of the permanent staff had been there for years, comfortable with traditional training methods that had worked for decades. The idea of a young female Marine coming in to shake things up didn't sit well with everyone, particularly Lieutenant Colonel David Martinez. Martinez had been the senior marksmanship instructor and range safety officer at Fort Harrison for 8 years. At 45, he was career Army, worked his way up from enlisted ranks, and took pride in maintaining what he called proven training standards. He was built like a linebacker, stood about 6'2", and had a way of looking at you that made it clear he was evaluating whether you measured up to his expectation. His office walls were covered with certificates, unit citations, and photos of him with various commanding officers spanning nearly 2 decades of service. During my initial interview process, which took place over a series of video calls while I was still stationed in California, Martinez had been professional but distant. He'd asked standard questions about my experience, reviewed my service record, and seemed satisfied with my qualification. It wasn't until I arrived for my first day that I realized the difference between paper credentials and base politics. The morning of my arrival, I reported to the range complex at 0600, dressed in appropriate civilian instructor attire, tactical pants, polo shirt with the Fort Harrison Training Division logo, and sturdy boots suitable for range work. I'd arrived early, wanting to familiarize myself with the facilities before the day officially began. The range complex was impressive, featuring multiple firing lines, distances from 25 meters out to 800 meters, and state-of-the-art target systems that could be controlled electronically. I was examining one of the longer-range shooting positions when Martinez appeared, coffee mug in hand, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He gave me a brief nod and launched into what felt more like a warning than an orient. Fort Harrison maintained strict safety protocols, he explained. Every instructor was expected to demonstrate absolute competence before being cleared to work with soldiers. The base had never had an incident on his watch, and he intended to keep it that way. The other instructors began arriving around 6:30, and I quickly realized I was the only woman on the team. Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, who'd been assigned as my initial training partner, was friendly enough, but I could see her watching me carefully, probably wondering if I'd be able to handle the physical demands of range instruction. Marcus Thompson, a former Army Ranger who'd transitioned to civilian instruction 2 years earlier, seemed more welcoming. He'd heard good things about Marine training methods, he said, and was curious to see what new techniques I might bring to the program. The first week passed without major incident. I observed existing training protocols, learned the base's specific procedures, and began working with small groups of soldiers under supervision. My approach differed from the traditional Fort Harrison method in several key ways. Where the standard instruction focused heavily on repetitive drills and rigid shooting positions, I incorporated more adaptive techniques, teaching soldiers to shoot accurately from unconventional positions, under time pressure, and with equipment that might not be functioning perfectly. This last point became particularly relevant when I noticed something troubling about the base's equipment maintenance practices. Many of the training rifles showed signs of wear that went beyond normal use. Triggers were inconsistent, scopes weren't properly zeroed, and several weapons had been marked as training use only when they could have been easily repaired. When I mentioned this to Rodriguez during a break between training sessions, she just Martinez prefers we focus on fundamentals, she explained. His theory is that if you can shoot well with subpar equipment, you'll be deadly with properly maintained gear. It was a philosophy I understood in principle, but in practice it seemed like the base was using outdated weapons as a crutch rather than addressing fundamental maintenance issues. The tension began building during my second week when I was assigned to work with a group of soldiers who'd been struggling to meet the new federal marksmanship standard. These weren't raw recruits, they were experienced soldiers from various Army units who'd been sent to Fort Harrison specifically to improve their shooting scores before deploying to specialized assignments. Several had already been through the standard training program once and failed to achieve qualifying scores. Private Amanda Foster was typical of the group. 23 years old, from a small town in Ohio, she'd joined the Army right after high school and had been a solid soldier in every aspect except marksmanship. Her file showed she'd barely qualified on her initial weapons training and had been struggling ever since. She was scheduled to deploy with a reconnaissance unit in 3 months, but her shooting scores were preventing her from getting the assignment she'd trained for. Working with Amanda and soldiers like her, I began to see how the base's traditional approach wasn't addressing individual learning styles and physical differences. Amanda, for instance, was left-handed but had been forced to shoot right-handed because that's how the standard training was structured. When I suggested she try shooting from her natural dominant side, her accuracy improved immediately. This was exactly the kind of adaptive training the new federal program was supposed to encourage, but when Martinez observed one of my sessions, his reaction was less than enthusiastic. After dismissing the soldiers, he pulled me aside for what he called a guidance session. The Army had been training soldiers to shoot for longer than either of us had been alive, he reminded me. There was value in maintaining consistent standards, and soldiers needed to be able to perform with whatever equipment and in whatever conditions they might encounter in the field. I tried to explain that adapting training methods to individual soldiers didn't mean lowering standards. It meant finding more effective ways to help each soldier reach those standards. But Martinez wasn't interested in a philosophical discussion about training methodology. He wanted to see results using established methods, and if I couldn't deliver those results, perhaps I wasn't the right fit for Fort Harrison. The challenge came during my third week, on a Wednesday morning that started like any other. I'd been assigned to work with another group of struggling soldiers, and Martinez announced he'd be personally evaluating my instruction method. He'd selected what he called a practical assessment. I would demonstrate proper shooting technique using equipment randomly selected from the base's training inventory. The timing felt deliberate. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the base training coordinator, was scheduled to visit the range that morning as part of her monthly evaluation of the new federal training program. Walsh had been supportive of innovative training methods during our initial conversations, and I suspected Martinez wanted to demonstrate that traditional approaches were more reliable than the experimental techniques I'd been developing. The rifle he handed me looked like it had seen better decades. The stock was cracked along the pistol grip, held together with what appeared to be electrical tape. The scope mount was visibly loose, and when I performed a basic function check, the trigger mechanism felt like it was full of sand. This wasn't just a well-used training rifle, this was a weapon that should have been marked for maintenance or retirement. Problem with the equipment, Instructor Chen? Martinez asked, loud enough for the gathering crowd of soldiers and staff to hear. Several other instructors had found reasons to be near the firing line, and Captain Walsh was approaching with her evaluation clipboard in hand. I could have declined the demonstration. Safety protocols clearly stated that any weapon showing signs of malfunction should be immediately removed from service for inspection. But looking at the expectant faces around me, I realized this wasn't just about demonstrating shooting technique. This was about proving I belonged at Fort Harrison, that my methods were sound, and that adaptability was a strength, not a weakness. No problem at all, sir, I replied, accepting the rifle and moving toward the firing line. The target was set at 200 meters, a reasonable distance for demonstrating basic marksmanship skill. Under normal circumstances, with properly maintained equipment, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It would have been a routine demonstration, but as I settled into my shooting position and began to assess the weapon in my hands, I realized Martinez had unknowingly given me the perfect opportunity to showcase exactly what the new training program was designed to accomplish. The scope was not only loose, but had been knocked completely out of alignment. Rather than trying to use it, I removed it entirely and prepared to shoot using the rifle's iron sights. The trigger, despite feeling gritty, had a consistent breakpoint that I could work with. The cracked stock actually provided better grip texture than many factory stocks. Most importantly, the barrel in action appeared sound. The rifle would shoot accurately if handled properly. As I made these adjustments, I could hear murmuring from the observer. Some soldiers were probably wondering if I was going to embarrass myself with such obviously defective equipment. The other instructors were likely curious to see how I'd handle what appeared to be an impossible situation. Martinez stood with his arms crossed, wearing an expression that suggested he expected this demonstration to confirm his suspicions about unproven training methods. Captain Walsh positioned herself where she could observe both my shooting technique and the reactions of the other staff members. I'd worked with enough senior officers during my Marine career to recognize when someone was evaluating not just performance, but leadership and adaptability under pressure. Taking my position at the firing line, I went through the same mental preparation routine I'd used for 6 years of Marine training. Every weapon is different, but the fundamentals remain constant. Proper breathing, consistent sight picture, smooth trigger control, and follow-through. The key to shooting well with imperfect equipment isn't to fight the weapon's limitations, it's to understand them and adapt accordingly. The first shot surprised even me. Despite the weapon's obvious defects, it produced a clean hole in the target's 9-ring, just slightly right of center. The sound was different from what I'd expect from a properly maintained rifle, a bit more muzzle blast due to worn components, but the bullet had gone exactly where I'd aimed. I made a mental note of the slight right deviation and adjusted my point of aim for the second shot. This one struck the 10-ring dead center. By the third shot I'd completely compensated for the rifle's quirks, and was shooting better groups than many soldiers could achieve with perfect equipment. The murmuring behind me had stopped. The range was quiet except for the distant sound of training activities on other firing lines. I fired 7 more shots, each one landing within the target's 10-ring, creating a group that would have been respectable even under ideal conditions. As I cleared the weapon and stepped back from the firing line, I realized something had shifted in the atmosphere around me. The soldiers who'd been watching were no longer looking at me with curiosity or skepticism. They were looking at me with the kind of respect that comes from witnessing competence under pressure. Even some of the other instructors seemed genuinely impressed. But Martinez's expression hadn't changed. If anything, he looked more skeptical than before. As Captain Walsh approached to examine the target, he stepped forward with what appeared to be prepared remarks. "Impressive shooting," he began, "but I'm not sure what this demonstrates about training methodology. Anyone can get lucky with a few shots, and we can't base a training program on individual performance with defective equipment." Captain Walsh was studying the target with obvious interest. The 10 shots formed a group that measured less than 2 inches across. Precision shooting by any standard, particularly with the weapon I'd been given. She looked from the target to the rifle in my hands, then back to Martinez. "This equipment was randomly selected from our training inventory?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Standard training rifle, typical of what soldiers work with during basic marksmanship instruction." I could have remained silent and let the demonstration speak for itself, but looking at the soldiers who'd been watching, particularly Amanda Foster and others who'd been struggling with traditional training methods, I realized this was about more than just my own credibility. This was about proving that adaptability and innovative thinking could produce better results than rigid adherence to methods that weren't working for everyone. "With respect, sir," I said, addressing Martinez directly, "this wasn't luck and it wasn't about individual performance. This was about applying adaptive training principles that can be taught to any soldier willing to learn them." Martinez's eyebrows rose slightly. "Explain." "The scope mount on this rifle is loose to the point of being useless, so I removed it and used iron sight. The trigger is gritty, but it breaks consistently at about 4.5 pounds, so I adjusted my technique accordingly. The stock is cracked, but that actually provides better grip texture. Most soldiers would look at this rifle and see problems. The new training program teaches them to look at it and see opportunities to adapt." Captain Walsh was taking notes on her evaluation form. "And you believe this approach can be systematically taught?" "I know it can be, ma'am. I've been using these methods with the soldiers assigned to my training groups, and their scores have improved significantly. Private Foster, for example, improved her qualification score by 30% once we adjusted her technique to work with her natural shooting stance. This was true, and Amanda Foster nodded confirmation from where she stood with the other observing soldiers, but I could see Martinez wasn't pleased with the direction the conversation was taking. Instructor Chen raises some interesting points, he said, but we need to be careful about abandoning proven methods for unproven theories. Fort Harrison has maintained excellent safety and training records using established protocol. The word theories stung, particularly coming from someone who just watched me demonstrate the practical application of those supposedly theoretical methods. But before I could respond, Captain Walsh stepped in. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, I'd like to see more detailed data on training outcomes from both traditional methods and Instructor Chen's adaptive approach. Can you have that ready for my next evaluation visit? Of course, ma'am. Though I should note that meaningful evaluation requires larger sample sizes and longer observation periods than we've had available. It was a reasonable point, but it also felt like the beginning of a stalling tactic. As Captain Walsh concluded her visit, and the crowd of observers began to disperse, I realized that my successful demonstration hadn't resolved anything. It had simply set the stage for a larger conflict about training philosophy and change management. Martinez approached me as I was cleaning the rifle I'd used for the demonstration. Impressive shooting, he said, though his tone suggested the compliment came with conditions. But remember, we're training soldiers, not competing in marksmanship competition. Soldiers need to be able to perform under stress, with standard equipment, using methods they can rely on regardless of circumstances. I agree completely, sir. That's exactly why adaptive training methods are so valuable. They teach soldiers to perform well under any circumstances, with any equipment, by understanding fundamental principles rather than just memorizing procedures. We'll see, Martinez replied, and walked away. Standing alone on the now quiet firing range, still holding the supposedly broken rifle that had just produced a near-perfect target, I realized I'd accomplished exactly what I'd set out to do, and potentially created a much larger problem for myself in the process. The demonstration had proven that innovative training methods could produce exceptional results, but it had also highlighted the fundamental disagreement between my approach and the established culture at Fort Harrison. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes in how I was being treated by different members of the staff. The soldiers I'd been working with seemed more confident and engaged during training sessions. Several approached me privately to ask about specific techniques they'd observed during the demonstration. Word had apparently spread throughout the base about what had happened on the range, and younger soldiers, in particular, were curious about training methods that might help them improve their own performance. But the reaction from some of the permanent instructional staff was more. A few, like Marcus Thompson and Lisa Rodriguez, were genuinely interested in learning about adaptive techniques and incorporating them into their own teaching. Others seemed to view my methods with suspicion, as if success achieved through non-traditional approaches somehow diminished the value of conventional training. Martinez himself became noticeably more distant and formal in our interaction. He began assigning me to work with the most challenging training groups, soldiers who'd already failed standard qualification multiple times, and were considered unlikely to improve significantly regardless of instruction method. On the surface, this appeared to be giving me opportunities to prove my techniques with difficult cases. In reality, I suspected it was setting me up for failure with soldiers who might be beyond help using any training method. The pressure was building, and I could sense that my position at Fort Harrison was becoming more tenuous despite the apparent success of my teaching method. The federal training program I'd been hired to help implement was supposed to be evaluated based on measurable improvement in soldier performance, but I was beginning to realize that institutional resistance might be a bigger obstacle than any technical training challenge. What I didn't know was that Martinez was already documenting what he perceived as problems with my approach, building a case that would eventually threaten not just my job but my entire career in military training. The broken rifle demonstration had been just the beginning of a conflict that would test everything I believed about leadership, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what you know is right. The first real sign that Martinez had moved from professional skepticism to active opposition came during a routine training evaluation 3 weeks after my demonstration with the damaged rifle. I'd been working with a squad of soldiers preparing for deployment to Eastern Europe, focusing on practical marksmanship skills they'd actually need in the field. The session was going exceptionally well when Martinez appeared at the range, with what he introduced as a quality assurance review. What followed was unlike any evaluation I'd experienced during 6 years of Marine Corps instruction. Martinez positioned himself directly behind the firing line, close enough that his presence was impossible to ignore but far enough that he couldn't be accused of interfering. Every time I made a coaching correction or suggested a technique adjustment,
He made notes on his clipboard with exaggerated precision, as if documenting evidence of wrongdoing. When Private Foster asked about the left-handed shooting stance we'd been working on, Martinez stepped forward before I could respond. Private, regulation shooting positions are designed to work for all soldiers, regardless of personal preference. Instructor Chen's methods might seem easier, but they won't help you when you're issued standard equipment in a combat situation. The statement was technically accurate but deliberately misleading. Adaptive techniques didn't replace standard positions. They expanded a soldier's toolkit for situations where standard approaches weren't effective. But correcting a superior officer in front of soldiers would have been inappropriate and potentially career-ending. After dismissing the training group, Martinez requested a private discussion in his office. The conversation that followed made it clear that my position at Fort Harrison was no longer about training effectiveness or program implementation. It had become personal. Instructor Chen, Martinez began, settling behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. I've been reviewing your training records and observing your methods, and I have serious concerns about the direction of your instruction. I prepared for this conversation, knowing it was inevitable. What specific concerns, sir? You're teaching soldiers to bypass established protocols. You're encouraging them to modify equipment without authorization. You're promoting techniques that haven't been validated through proper Army training doctrine. He opened a folder thick with documentation. These aren't minor procedural issues. These are fundamental departures from proven method. Each accusation contained a grain of truth wrapped in misleading context. Yes, I taught soldiers to adapt when standard methods weren't working. Yes, I showed them how to make minor adjustments to equipment for better performance. Yes, my techniques differed from traditional instruction, but I'd never encouraged soldiers to bypass safety protocols or ignore proper procedures. Sir, every technique I've taught has been focused on improving performance within established safety parameters. The federal training program specifically calls for innovative approaches to help soldiers achieve qualification standards they're currently struggling to meet. Martinez leaned back in his chair, studying me with the expression of someone who'd already made up his mind. The federal program calls for improved results, not experimental methods, results that can't be consistently replicated across different instructors and different students. This was the crux of his argument, and it wasn't entirely wrong. My methods required instructors to understand underlying principles rather than simply following scripted procedures. They demanded more individual attention and adaptive thinking. They were harder to standardize and evaluate using traditional metrics, but they were. The soldiers I'd been training were not only meeting qualification standards, they were exceeding them by margins that would have been impossible using conventional instruction alone. Sir, the data supports the effectiveness of adaptive training method. Soldiers in my groups have shown consistent improvement across all measured categories. Data can be manipulated, Martinez replied dismissively. What matters is whether these methods can be implemented consistently across the entire base, with all instructors, for all soldiers. From what I've observed, your success depends entirely on your personal expertise, not on teachable techniques. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be difficult to refute immediately. I had been successful partly because of my extensive background in marksmanship training, and some of the techniques I used did require instructor judgment that couldn't be easily codified in a training manual. With respect, sir, any effective training method requires skilled instructors. The question isn't whether these techniques can be taught by anyone, it's whether they can be taught by qualified professionals to produce better outcomes for soldiers. Martinez closed the folder with a sound that felt final. Here's what's going to happen, Instructor Chen. You're going to continue working with assigned training groups using standard Fort Harrison protocols. No more experimental techniques. No more equipment modifications. No more special accommodations for individual soldiers. If you can produce improved results using established methods, then we'll have something meaningful to evaluate. The directive was clear, but it was also professionally impossible. The soldiers I'd been assigned to work with had already failed to improve using standard methods. That's why they'd been sent to me in the first place. Restricting me to conventional techniques meant setting up both me and my students for failure. And if the soldiers don't improve using standard methods, I asked, then perhaps the problem isn't with the methods. Martinez replied, perhaps some soldiers aren't capable of meeting the standards required for their assignments, regardless of instruction quality.
Walking back to my quarters that evening, I realized Martinez had engineered a perfect trap. Either I defied his direct order and continued using adaptive techniques, giving him grounds for disciplinary action, or I followed his directive and watched my students fail, proving his point that my previous success had been temporary and unreplicable. The next few weeks were among the most frustrating of my career. Working with soldiers who'd shown dramatic improvement using adaptive methods, I was now forced to restrict my instruction to conventional approaches that had already proven ineffective for these specific individuals. Private Foster, who'd been shooting confidently and accurately in her natural left-handed stance, struggled to maintain her progress when forced back to standard right-handed positions. Sergeant Williams, a career soldier whose deployment was pending completion of advanced marksmanship training, had been making excellent progress with breathing techniques adapted for his respiratory issues developed during previous overseas assignments. Restricted to standard breathing protocols, his accuracy declined noticeably, and his confidence began to erode. Most heartbreaking was watching young soldiers who'd begun to believe they could succeed start to doubt themselves again. Amanda Foster approached me after a particularly difficult training session, her eyes reflecting the same defeat I'd seen during our first meeting. "Ma'am, am I just not cut out for this? I was doing so well before, but now I can't seem to hit anything consistently." I wanted to tell her the truth that she was perfectly capable but was being forced to use methods that didn't match her natural abilities. Instead, I had to encourage her to keep trying while knowing the current approach was setting her up for failure. "Keep working on the fundamentals, Private Foster. Sometimes progress isn't linear." It was technically true but felt like a betrayal of everything I believed about effective instruction and honest communication with students. The situation became even more complicated when Captain Walsh returned for her follow-up evaluation. Martinez had clearly been preparing for this visit, organizing demonstrations that showcased traditional training methods, while carefully scheduling my restricted instruction sessions during times when Walsh wouldn't observe them directly. During her brief conversation with me, Walsh seemed puzzled by what she was seeing. "Instructor Chen, the initial reports on your adaptive training methods were very positive, but the recent data suggest performance improvements have plateaued or even declined in some cases. Can you explain what's changed?" I found myself in an impossible position. Explaining the restrictions Martinez had imposed would sound like making excuses or undermining my superior officer, but allowing Walsh to believe my methods were ineffective would damage both my credibility and the broader federal training program. "Ma'am, there have been some adjustments to training protocols as we work to standardize approaches across all instructional staff. We're still evaluating the best methods for consistent implementation." It was a diplomatic non-answer that satisfied nobody, least of all myself. Walsh made notes that I suspected weren't favorable, and Martinez's satisfied expression suggested the conversation had gone exactly as he'd hoped. That evening, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found me in the base recreation center, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. "Sarah, can I speak frankly?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me. I nodded, grateful for any honest conversation after weeks of careful diplomatic language. "What Martinez is doing to you isn't right, and it isn't good for the soldiers either. I've been instructing here for 4 years, and I've never seen students improve the way they did during your first few weeks. Now they're struggling again, and it's not because they've forgotten how to shoot, it's because they're being forced to use methods that don't work for them." Rodriguez's confirmation of what I'd been observing was both validating and deeply troubling. If experienced instructors could see the problem, then Martinez certainly understood what was happening. His restrictions weren't about maintaining training standards, they were about proving a point at the expense of soldier readiness. "Lisa, I appreciate your support, but there's not much I can do without directly defying order." "Maybe there is," she replied quietly, glancing around to ensure our conversation remained private. "Marcus and I have been talking with some of the other instructors, and we think you should know what's really going on here." What Rodriguez told me over the next hour changed my understanding of the entire situation at Fort Harrison. Martinez's resistance to innovative training methods wasn't just about professional conservatism or institutional inertia. It was about protecting a system that benefited him personally and professionally. Fort Harrison's traditional training program had a deliberate failure rate built into its design. Approximately 30% of soldiers who came through advanced marksmanship training were expected to fail to meet qualification standards. This wasn't considered a bug in the system, it was a feature. Soldiers who failed were recycled through the program multiple times, generating additional training revenue for the base and justifying expanded instructor positions and equipment budget. Martinez had spent years optimizing this system, ensuring that Fort Harrison was seen as a necessary but challenging training facility that weeded out soldiers who weren't truly committed to excellence. His professional reputation was built on maintaining rigorous standards that many soldiers couldn't meet on their first attempt. My adaptive training methods threatened this entire structure. If soldiers could achieve qualification standards more consistently on their first attempt, there would be less need for recycled training, fewer instructor positions, and smaller equipment budgets. Success paradoxically would be seen as a threat to the base's mission and Martinez's position. "He's been building a case against you since your first week," Rodriguez explained. "Every time one of your students succeeds using your methods, it proves the traditional approach was unnecessarily difficult. Every time they fail using standard methods after showing improvement with your techniques, it proves his point that your success was temporary." Marcus Thompson joined our conversation, bringing with him a perspective from his previous Army Ranger experience that added another dimension to the situation. "Sarah, you need to understand that Martinez isn't just protecting his training program, he's protecting his pathway to promotion. His next assignment depends on his evaluation as senior instructor here, and that evaluation is based partly on maintaining Fort Harrison's reputation as a demanding but fair training facility. If your methods make training too easy, it undermines everything he's built his career on." The personal stakes explained Martinez's increasingly hostile behavior, but they also made the situation more dangerous for me. This wasn't just about professional disagreement over training methods. This was about career survival for a senior officer who saw my success as a direct threat to his future. "What do you think I should do?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Document everything," Rodriguez replied immediately. "Every restriction he's placed on your instruction, every conversation, every evaluation. If this escalates, you're going to need evidence that you've been prevented from using the methods you were hired to implement." Thompson nodded agreement. "And start reaching out to your contacts outside Fort Harrison. If Martinez decides to damage your reputation, you'll need people who can vouch for your competence and character." Their advice was sound, but it also represented a fundamental shift in how I'd been approaching the situation. Up to this point, I'd been trying to work within the system, hoping to prove the value of adaptive training methods through results rather than confrontation. Now I was being advised to prepare for a conflict that might determine not just my position at Fort Harrison, but my entire future in military training. The next morning brought a development that accelerated everything beyond my control. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander, announced an unscheduled visit to observe training operations and evaluate the implementation of the federal training program. Unlike Captain Walsh's focused evaluations, Colonel Hayes would be conducting a comprehensive review that included direct observation of instruction, interviews with soldiers and staff, and analysis of performance data across all training groups. Martinez called an emergency staff meeting to prepare for Hayes's visit, and his instructions made it clear that he viewed this as a make-or-break moment for his leadership of the marksmanship program. "Colonel Hayes is going to see a training program that demonstrates excellence, consistency, and adherence to proven military standards," he announced to the assembled instructors. "Every class she observes needs to showcase our commitment to time-tested methods that produce reliable results." He looked directly at me when he continued, "Any instructor who attempts to experiment with unproven techniques during Colonel Hayes's visit will be subject to immediate disciplinary action. This is not the time for individual creativity. This is the time to demonstrate that Fort Harrison maintains the highest standards of military training." The message was unmistakable. If I used adaptive training methods during Hayes's observation, Martinez would treat it as insubordination. If I didn't use them, the soldiers Hayes observed would likely struggle with the standard methods that had already proven ineffective for them. After the meeting, I found myself facing the same impossible choice Martinez had been engineering for weeks, but now with career-ending consequences attached to either option. The difference was that Colonel Hayes represented the first opportunity I'd had to present my case to someone with the authority to override Martinez's restrictions. That night, alone in my quarters, I made the decision that would determine everything that followed. I would continue using the training methods I knew were effective, regardless of Martinez's threats. The soldiers deserved instruction that gave them the best chance of success, and the federal training program deserved an honest evaluation based on results rather than politics. But I would also document every aspect of what happened next, building the comprehensive record that Rodriguez and Thompson had recommended. If Martinez wanted a confrontation, I would be prepared with evidence that showed exactly what was at stake and who was responsible for the outcome. The next week would test everything I believed about leadership, integrity, and the courage to do what's right even when it's professionally dangerous. Martinez had engineered a situation where he thought he couldn't lose, but he'd underestimated both my commitment to effective training and my willingness to accept personal risk to protect the soldiers depending on me for their success. Colonel Hayes's visit would force both of us to show our true priorities,
and the consequences would reshape not just my career but the future of military training at Fort Harrison. Colonel Patricia Hayes arrived at Fort Harrison on a crisp Tuesday morning in late November, her reputation preceding her like a weather front. At 52, Hayes was a career officer who'd earned her stars through combat leadership in Afghanistan and Iraq, followed by successful commands at increasingly complex installations. Unlike many senior officers who'd spent their later careers in administrative roles, Hayes maintained a hands-on leadership style that included unannounced visits to training facilities and direct conversations with soldiers at every level. I first saw her stepping out of an unmarked sedan near the range complex, dressed in standard Army combat uniforms without the typical entourage of aides and staff officers that usually accompanied visiting dignitaries. She moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to getting accurate information quickly, and her first stop wasn't Martinez's office, it was the armory, where she spent 30 minutes examining training weapons and equipment. Word of her arrival spread through the base faster than wildfire, and Martinez appeared at the range complex within minutes, slightly out of breath and wearing the forced smile of someone who'd been caught unprepared. Hayes acknowledged his presence with a brief nod but continued her systematic inspection of facilities, asking detailed questions about maintenance schedules, equipment serviceability rates, and safety protocol. Colonel Hayes, welcome to Fort Harrison, Martinez began, launching into what sounded like a rehearsed presentation about the base's training mission and recent performance metrics. We're honored to have you observe our world-class marksmanship program. Hayes held up a hand to stop him mid-sentence. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, I'll need to review your program documentation, but first I want to see actual training in progress. Which groups are scheduled for instruction this morning? The question was routine, but Martinez's hesitation suggested he was rapidly recalculating his planned presentation. Ma'am, we have several groups scheduled, including some advanced students working with our most experienced instructor. I want to see your most challenging students, Hayes replied firmly. Show me soldiers who are struggling to meet standards and the instruction they're receiving to help them improve. This was exactly what Martinez had been trying to avoid. His preference would have been to showcase successful students working with conventional methods, demonstrating that traditional approaches were effective and consistent. Instead, Hayes wanted to observe the exact scenario where adaptive training methods made the biggest difference, and where Martinez's restrictions were causing the most problem. I was scheduled to work with a group of 8 soldiers that morning, all of whom had failed to meet qualification standards during previous training cycles. Under normal circumstances, this would have been an ideal opportunity to demonstrate how adaptive techniques could help struggling students achieve success. Under Martinez's restrictions, it was setting up both me and the soldiers for public failure in front of the base commander. As Hayes approached the firing line where my training group was assembling, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I would teach these soldiers using the methods I knew were effective, regardless of Martinez's threat. The worst outcome of his disciplinary action would be losing my job, but the worst outcome of following his restrictions would be watching soldiers fail when I knew they could succeed. Private Foster was among the students that morning, along with several others I'd worked with during the brief period before Martinez's limitations were imposed. They looked nervous, not just because of the presence of the base commander, but because they'd experienced both success with adaptive methods and subsequent struggles with conventional approaches. They knew which techniques worked for them, but they also understood the political pressure to use only approved methods. Good morning, soldiers, I began, settling into the teaching rhythm that had become second nature during 6 years of Marine instruction. Today we're going to focus on practical marksmanship skills, using equipment and conditions you might actually encounter in the field. Martinez positioned himself where he could observe both my instruction and Hayes's reactions, clearly prepared to intervene if I deviated from approved protocol. But Hayes seemed more interested in watching the soldiers than monitoring my teaching methods, and her questions were focused on practical outcomes rather than procedural compliance. I started with basic position work, but immediately began incorporating the adaptive techniques that had proven effective with these specific students. When Private Foster naturally shifted toward her dominant side shooting stance, I encouraged the adjustment rather than correcting. When Sergeant Williams began using the breathing techniques that accommodated his respiratory limitations, I built on that foundation rather than forcing him back to standard protocol. Instructor Chen, Martinez interrupted after about 10 minutes. Are you following the established training outline for this group? It was a loaded question designed to put me in an impossible position. Answering yes would be dishonest, but answering no would confirm his allegations of insubordination in front of Colonel Hayes. Sir, I'm using training methods that have proven most effective with these particular soldiers, based on their individual needs and previous performance data. Hayes looked up from her notes with obvious interest. What kind of individual adaptations are you referring to, Instructor Chen? This was the moment I'd been preparing for without knowing. Everything I'd learned about effective communication during my Marine career, every successful training session I'd conducted, every principle I believed about honest leadership came down to this single opportunity to explain why adaptive methods matter. Ma'am, each soldier brings different physical attributes, learning styles and previous experiences to their training. Private Foster, for example, is naturally left-handed, but has been forced to shoot right-handed because that's the standard protocol. When she shoots from her natural dominant side, her accuracy improves by over 40%. The question isn't whether her technique matches regulation positions, it's whether she can engage targets effectively when her unit needs her to. Hayes turned to Foster direct. Private, is that accurate? Foster glanced nervously at Martinez before answering. Yes, ma'am. When I shoot left-handed, everything feels more natural and I can see the sights better. But I've been told that's not the proper way to do it. And what happens when you shoot right-handed? I struggle to get consistent groups, ma'am. The sight picture never feels quite right, and I have to think about every step instead of just focusing on the target. Hayes made more notes, then addressed Martinez. Lieutenant Colonel, what's the rationale for requiring right-handed shooting positions for naturally left-handed soldiers? Martinez had clearly anticipated this question, and had a prepared response. Ma'am, military standardization exists for important reasons. In combat situations, soldiers need to be able to use whatever equipment is available, work effectively in team formations, and follow consistent procedures regardless of personal preferences. Training soldiers to accommodate individual differences might seem easier, but it doesn't prepare them for the realities of military service. It was a reasonable argument that contained enough truth to be persuasive, particularly to senior officers who understood the importance of military standardization. But it also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what adaptive training was designed to accomplish.
Colonel Hayes, I said, knowing I was taking a significant professional risk by contradicting a superior officer. Adaptive training doesn't replace standardization, it builds on it. Private Foster can shoot effectively from either side now, but she shoots exceptionally well from her natural side. In combat, she'd use whatever position the situation required, but knowing her optimal technique means she can deliver more accurate fire when precision matters most. Hayes observed the next phase of training with particular attention, watching as soldiers moved between different shooting positions and adapted their techniques to various scenarios I presented. What she saw was exactly what I'd hoped to demonstrate. Soldiers who understood fundamental principles were more effective than soldiers who simply memorized procedure. When we moved to practical exercises using the same type of worn training equipment that had featured in my original demonstration with Martinez, the differences became even more apparent. Soldiers who'd learned adaptive techniques could maintain accuracy even when their equipment wasn't perfect. Those who'd only learned standard procedures struggled when conditions varied from ideal. Interesting, Hayes commented, watching Private Foster adjust quickly to a rifle with a slightly bent front sight. How long did it take her to learn that adaptation? About 15 minutes of explanation and practice, ma'am. Once soldiers understand the underlying principles of sight alignment and sight picture, they can adapt to equipment variations much more quickly. Martinez stepped forward with obvious frustration. Colonel Hayes, this kind of individualized instruction requires extensive time and attention that isn't practical for large-scale training operations. We can't customize every soldier's training to accommodate personal preferences. Lieutenant Colonel, I'm not seeing customization here. I'm seeing soldiers who understand their equipment and can adapt to changing conditions. Isn't that exactly what we want from combat-ready troops? The question hung in the air like smoke from a rifle shot. Martinez's entire argument depended on portraying adaptive techniques as impractical accommodation, rather than enhanced capability, but Hayes was experienced enough to recognize the difference. After observing training for nearly 2 hours, Hayes requested private meetings with several soldiers, instructors and administrative staff. I wasn't included in these conversations, but Marcus Thompson and Lisa Rodriguez both participated, and I suspected their input would be crucial to whatever conclusions Hayes was forming. That afternoon, Hayes observed a different training group working with another instructor using purely conventional methods. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Soldiers struggled with equipment they didn't understand, failed to adapt when conditions changed, and became frustrated when standard procedures didn't produce the results they expected. Martinez seemed increasingly agitated as the day progressed, apparently recognizing that his carefully planned demonstration of traditional training superiority wasn't having the intended effect. During a brief break between observations, he approached me with barely controlled anger. "Instructor Chen, your deliberate insubordination this morning was noted and will be documented in your personnel file. Your contract specifically requires adherence to established training protocols, and you've chosen to violate those requirements in front of the base command. Sir, my contract requires me to implement effective training methods that help soldiers achieve qualification standards. The federal program guidance specifically calls for innovative approaches that improve outcomes. The federal program calls for results, not rebellion against military authority. You've made your position clear and I've made mine clear. We'll let Colonel Hayes decide which approach better serves the interests of military readiness." His words carried the weight of an ultimatum, but they also revealed something important about his mindset. Martinez saw this situation as a competition between his authority and my methods, rather than a collaboration focused on soldier success. That perspective explained why he'd been willing to restrict effective training techniques. He viewed my success as his failure. That evening, Hayes conducted what she termed informal conversations with various base personnel at the recreation center. Unlike formal interviews conducted in offices, these discussions happened over coffee and casual meals, creating an environment where people might speak more honestly about their experiences and observations. I was surprised when Hayes approached my table and asked if she could join me. For the next hour she asked detailed questions about my background, training philosophy and experiences at Fort Harrison. Her questions were probing but not hostile, and she seemed genuinely interested in understanding both the technical aspects of adaptive training and the institutional challenges I'd encountered. "Instructor Chen, I've reviewed your service record and your qualifications are impressive. You've also received strong endorsements from several Marines officers I respect. Help me understand why you've encountered such resistance to your methods here at Fort Harrison." The question was an opportunity to present my case directly to someone with the authority to make meaningful changes, but it also required careful consideration of how much criticism of Martinez would be appropriate or productive. "Ma'am, I think there are honest philosophical differences about how to balance standardization with effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez has spent years developing training protocols that work well for many soldiers, and he's understandably cautious about changing proven methods. My experience suggests that adaptive techniques can help soldiers who struggle with conventional approaches, but implementing those techniques does require different instructor skills and evaluation methods." Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying me with the expression of someone trying to assess not just what I was saying but what I wasn't saying. "That's a diplomatic response, but I'm more interested in your honest assessment. Based on what I observed today, there seem to be significant differences in student outcomes between different instruction methods. What do you think is causing that variation?" This was the moment of truth. I could continue offering diplomatic non-answers that avoided direct criticism of Martinez, or I could provide the honest assessment Hayes was requesting, knowing it might destroy any possibility of working relationships with the senior staff at Fort Harrison. "Ma'am, I believe the current system is designed to maintain consistent failure rates, rather than maximize soldier success. Traditional methods work well for some students, but when they don't work, the assumption is that the soldier lacks ability rather than that the instruction method might not be the best fit. Adaptive techniques help soldiers succeed who might otherwise be recycled through training multiple times." Hayes made notes on what appeared to be a personal notebook rather than official documentation. "And what do you think motivates resistance to methods that could reduce failure rate?" The question cut to the heart of everything Rodriguez and Thompson had explained about the institutional dynamics at Fort Harrison. Answering it honestly would essentially accuse Martinez of prioritizing institutional interests over soldier welfare. "Ma'am, I think there are complex factors involving budget justifications, staffing requirements, and professional reputations that might create incentives to maintain status quo approaches even when better alternatives are available." It was still a diplomatic response, but Hayes nodded as if I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. "One final question, Instructor Chen. If you were given complete authority to design a marksmanship training program from scratch, what would you do different?" "I'd create a system that started with adaptive principles as the foundation rather than treating them as exceptions. Soldiers would learn standard procedures, but they'd also understand why those procedures work and how to modify them when conditions require adaptation. Instructors would be trained to recognize individual learning differences and equipped with techniques to help every soldier achieve success, rather than identifying who can succeed with existing methods. Hayes closed her notebook and stood to leave. "Thank you for your honesty. I'll be making my recommendations to the training command within the next few days." As she walked away, I realized that I'd essentially advocated for completely restructuring the training program Martinez had spent years developing. Regardless of Hayes's ultimate decision, there was no possibility of continuing to work at Fort Harrison under current leadership. I'd chosen honesty over job security, principle over political safety. The next morning brought a development that accelerated everything beyond anyone's control. Amanda Foster's unit received sudden deployment orders, moving up their overseas assignment by 6 weeks. She needed to achieve qualification scores within the next 5 days or be removed from the deployment roster, a change that would effectively end her career in her chosen military specialty. Martinez called an emergency meeting to address what he termed exceptional circumstances, requiring focused remedial training for soldiers facing immediate deployment requirements. His proposed solution was intensive conventional training using the same methods that had already proven ineffective for these specific soldiers. "Instructor Chen," he announced in front of the assembled staff, "you'll be working with Private Foster and the other affected soldiers, using our established accelerated training protocol. This is not the time for experimental methods. This is the time to apply maximum intensity using proven techniques." It was the final trap he'd been engineering for weeks. Foster and several other soldiers needed to succeed using conventional methods that had already failed them, or face career-ending consequences. If I defied his direct orders to use only approved techniques, he could justify immediate disciplinary action. If I followed his orders, the soldiers would likely fail, proving his point about the unreliability of adaptive methods. But there was something Martinez hadn't anticipated in his careful planning. Colonel Hayes hadn't left Fort Harrison after completing her observation. She was still on base, conducting follow-up interviews and reviewing documentation. More importantly, she'd specifically requested to observe any emergency training sessions that might occur during her extended visit. Standing in that meeting room, facing Martinez's ultimatum while knowing that Hayes would be watching everything that happened next, I made the decision that would determine not just my future but the future of every soldier who'd been failed by a system more concerned with institutional protection than individual success. I would teach these soldiers using every effective technique I knew, regardless of the consequence. If Martinez wanted to destroy my career for helping soldiers succeed, he'd have to do it in front of a colonel who'd already seen the difference between methods that worked and methods that protected the status quo. The next 5 days would reveal whether integrity and effectiveness could overcome institutional inertia and personal politics, or whether good soldiers would pay the price for a system that prioritized control over competence. The emergency training session began at dawn on Wednesday morning, with 8 soldiers whose careers hung in the balance, and 2 very different philosophies about what constituted effective military instruction. Colonel Hayes positioned herself at an observation point that provided clear sight lines to both the firing positions and the instructor areas, making it impossible for anyone to ignore her presence or misunderstand the significance of what was about to unfold. Martinez arrived early, carrying a thick folder of documentation and wearing the expression of someone prepared for a definitive confrontation. He'd spent the previous evening preparing what he clearly intended to be the final demonstration of why experimental training methods were unsuitable for military applications under pressure. His plan was simple: restrict me to conventional techniques, document the inevitable failures when soldiers couldn't perform under stress, and use those failures to justify removing both me and my disruptive influence from Fort Harrison. Private Foster stood with the other 7 soldiers, her face reflecting the weight of knowing that her entire military future would be determined by her performance over the next few days. She'd already experienced success using adaptive techniques, and subsequent struggles when forced back to standard methods. Now she faced the ultimate test with her unit deployment hanging in the balance and 2 senior leaders who held fundamentally different views about how she should be trained. As the soldiers assembled their equipment and prepared for what Martinez had designated intensive remedial instruction, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of beginning with shooting positions or equipment familiarization, I started by addressing the psychological pressure that was affecting every soldier on that firing line. Before we discuss technique, I announced, we need to acknowledge something that everyone here understands but nobody wants to talk about. You've all been told that your previous failures were due to inadequate preparation or insufficient commitment. That's not true. Your failures were due to training methods that didn't match your individual learning styles and physical attributes. Martinez stepped forward immediately,
his face darkening with anger. Instructor Chen, this is not the time for motivational speech. These soldiers need focused technical instruction using proven methods. Sir, these soldiers need confidence as much as they need technique. They've been convinced they're not capable of success when the reality is that they haven't been given instruction that enables success. Colonel Hayes made notes without changing expression, but I caught her glance toward Martinez that suggested she was evaluating more than just training methodology. The dynamic between leadership styles was as important as the specific techniques being demonstrated. I turned back to the soldiers, who were watching this exchange with obvious tension. For the next 5 days, we're going to use every effective technique available to help you achieve qualification standards. Some of these techniques will be conventional, and some will be adaptations based on your individual needs. The goal isn't to follow procedures, it's to put accurate rounds on target when it matters. Instructor Chen, Martinez interrupted sharply, you are specifically directed to use established training protocols. Any deviation from approved methods will result in immediate disciplinary action. The confrontation Hayes had been observing indirectly for 2 days was now happening directly in front of her, with 8 soldiers as unwilling witnesses to a conflict between 2 philosophies of military leadership. I could have backed down, followed Martinez's orders, and watched these soldiers fail using methods that had already proven ineffective for them. Instead, I made a choice that would define not just my career but my integrity as a military professional. Sir, my primary obligation is to these soldiers and their success. I will use whatever training methods are most effective, and I will accept responsibility for the consequences. The words hung in the morning air like gunpowder residue, sharp and unmistakable. Martinez's face went through several shades of anger before settling on something approaching fury. Hayes continued taking notes, but her posture suggested she was witnessing something more significant than a simple disagreement about training technique. Very well, Martinez replied with forced calm. Continue with your instruction. Colonel Hayes will observe the results, and we'll see whose methods better serve military readiness. What followed was the most intense and comprehensive marksmanship instruction I'd ever conducted. Working with 8 soldiers who had very different learning needs and physical attributes, I demonstrated every adaptive technique I'd developed during 6 years of Marine training, modified for their specific challenges, and compressed into an accelerated timeline that would have been impossible using conventional step-by-step procedure. Private Foster returned to her natural left-handed shooting stance, and her accuracy immediately improved to levels she'd never achieved using right-handed positions. Sergeant Williams used breathing techniques adapted for his respiratory limitations, and his shot groups tightened dramatically. Each soldier worked on positions and techniques customized for their body type, hand size, eye dominance, and previous training background. But the real breakthrough came when I introduced what I called equipment mastery training. Instead of assuming soldiers would always have access to perfectly maintained weapons, I taught them to assess, adjust, and adapt to whatever equipment they were issued. Using the same type of worn training rifles that had featured in my original demonstration months earlier, soldiers learned to compensate for loose scope mounts, inconsistent triggers, and sight alignment issues. Martinez watched this instruction with growing agitation, clearly recognizing that the soldiers were not only learning effectively, but enjoying the process in a way that conventional training had never achieved. These weren't recruits being forced through repetitive drills. These were military professionals learning skills they could immediately apply to real-world situations. This is exactly the kind of individualized accommodation that can't be scaled across large training populations. Martinez commented to Hayes during a brief break, "What happens when these soldiers deploy and encounter equipment or conditions that don't match their customized training?" It was a valid concern, and Hayes directed the question to me. "Instructor Chen, how do you address the scalability issue?" Lieutenant Colonel Martinez raised. "Ma'am, adaptive training isn't about customization, it's about teaching fundamental principles that apply regardless of specific conditions. These soldiers aren't learning 8 different ways to shoot, they're learning why shooting techniques work and how to apply those principles when conditions vary from ideal." To demonstrate, I had each soldier work with equipment they'd never seen before, in positions they hadn't specifically practiced, engaging targets at distances we hadn't previously covered. Instead of struggling the way they would have with purely conventional training, they adapted quickly because they understood underlying principles rather than just memorized procedure. Hayes observed this demonstration with particular interest, occasionally asking soldiers to explain their thought process as they adapted to changing conditions. What she heard was exactly what effective military training should produce: professionals who could think through problems rather than just follow scripts. "Private Foster," Hayes called out during one exercise, Explain how you're adjusting for that damaged front sight. Ma'am, the sight is bent slightly to the right, so I'm aiming slightly left to compensate. It's the same principle as wind adjustment. You aim where you need to hit, not where the sights normally point, and you learned that technique today. Yes, ma'am, but it's based on sight alignment principles that apply to any shooting situation. Once you understand why sights work, you can adapt when they're not perfect. Martinez's frustration was becoming increasingly visible as soldiers demonstrated competence and confidence that conventional training had never produced. By the second day of emergency instruction, several soldiers were shooting better than they ever had during months of previous training cycles. The crisis came on Thursday afternoon when Martinez demanded a private conference with Hayes to present what he termed serious concerns about training safety and military discipline.
I wasn't included in this meeting, but Marcus Thompson observed Martinez entering the base headquarters building, carrying a thick folder of documentation and wearing the expression of someone prepared to make formal accusations. When Hayes emerged from that meeting, her demeanor had shifted from neutral observation to what appeared to be focused investigation. She spent the rest of the afternoon conducting individual interviews with soldiers, instructors, and administrative staff, asking detailed questions about training methods, safety protocols, and command relationships. That evening, Hayes requested a meeting with me in the base conference room. When I arrived, I found not just the colonel but also Captain Walsh, who had returned to Fort Harrison specifically for this discussion, and a stern-looking major I didn't recognize who introduced himself as Major Stevens from the Army Training and Doctrine Command. Instructor Chen, Hayes began, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez has raised several serious allegations about your conduct and training methods. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to these concerns before I make my final recommendation. The allegations, as Hayes outlined them, were more serious than I'd anticipated. Martinez had accused me of deliberately undermining military discipline, endangering soldier safety by encouraging unauthorized equipment modifications, and insubordination in the face of direct orders from a superior officer. He documented instances where I'd allegedly violated established protocols and characterized my methods as dangerous experimentation using soldiers as test subjects. Each accusation contained enough truth to be difficult to refute immediately, but each was also framed in the most damaging possible context. Yes, I'd encouraged soldiers to adapt techniques to their individual needs, but always within safety parameters and focused on improving performance. Yes, I'd shown them how to adjust equipment for better functionality, but never in ways that compromised safety or violated regulation. Yes, I'd continued using effective methods despite Martinez's restrictions, but only because those methods were producing better results for soldiers facing career-threatening deadlines. Ma'am, I replied carefully, I acknowledge that my methods differ from traditional Fort Harrison protocols, but every technique I've taught has been focused on improving soldier performance within established safety guidelines. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez and I have philosophical differences about training approaches, but I've never endangered soldiers or deliberately violated safety regulations. Major Stevens leaned forward with obvious skepticism. Instructor Chen, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez has provided detailed documentation of your refusal to follow direct orders regarding training protocols. How do you explain that insubordination? This was the moment I'd been preparing for without knowing it, the opportunity to explain not just what I'd done but why I'd done it, to people with the authority to understand the broader implications. Sir, I was hired specifically to implement innovative training methods under the federal program designed to improve soldier outcomes. When I was restricted from using the most effective techniques available, I faced a choice between following orders that would cause soldiers to fail, or using methods that would help them succeed. I chose to prioritize soldier success, even when directly ordered to use specific training protocols. Yes, sir. When those protocols had already proven ineffective for these specific soldiers and when their careers depended on achieving success within a critical time frame. Hayes had been listening without comment, but now she spoke with the tone of someone who had already reached preliminary conclusions. Instructor Chen, I've spent the past 3 days observing training outcomes, interviewing personnel and reviewing performance data. Before I make my final determination, I want you to demonstrate your methods one more time under controlled conditions, with Lieutenant Colonel Martinez present to document any safety violations or procedural deviation. It was either an opportunity to vindicate my approach or a trap designed to provide Martinez with definitive evidence of my alleged misconduct. Either way, it would determine not just my future at Fort Harrison, but potentially my entire career in military training. Friday morning's demonstration would be the culmination of months of conflict between two fundamentally different philosophies about military education, leadership, and the responsibility instructors have to the soldiers they serve. Martinez arrived with multiple observers and what appeared to be comprehensive documentation equipment, clearly prepared to record any evidence that could support his allegation. Private Foster and 3 other soldiers participated in what Hayes termed comprehensive skills evaluation, under observation. They would demonstrate their proficiency using both conventional techniques and the adaptive methods they'd learned during the week of emergency training. What happened during that final demonstration exceeded every expectation and surprised everyone involved, including me. The soldiers didn't just meet qualification standards, they exceeded them by margins that would have been considered exceptional under any circumstance. More importantly, they demonstrated genuine understanding of marksmanship principles and the ability to adapt their techniques to changing conditions in real time. When Foster engaged targets using a rifle she'd never seen before, shooting from positions she'd never specifically practiced, her performance was flawless. When equipment problems were deliberately introduced to test adaptability, the soldiers compensated smoothly and maintained accuracy. When Martinez himself selected targets, distances and conditions designed to challenge their skills, they responded with competence and confidence that spoke to deep understanding rather than rote memorization. The most telling moment came when Hayes asked each soldier to explain their shooting process to observers as they engaged targets. What she heard was professional analysis of sight picture, breathing control, trigger management, and follow-through that demonstrated mastery of fundamental concepts. "Ma'am," Foster explained as she prepared for one particularly challenging shot, "I'm compensating for the wind by aiming slightly into the breeze, adjusting my breathing pattern to account for the longer range and using a trigger control technique that works best with this particular weapon's characteristics. The principles are the same as basic marksmanship, but adapted for these specific conditions." Martinez watched this demonstration with an expression that cycled through surprise, grudging respect, and what appeared to be growing realization that his fundamental assumptions about training effectiveness might have been incorrect. When the demonstration concluded, Hayes dismissed the soldiers and observers, leaving only Martinez, myself, and the evaluation team in the conference room for final discussion. What followed was unlike any military debriefing I'd ever experienced. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez," Hayes began, "based on my observations over the past week, I have significant concerns about the training program you've been implementing at Fort Harrison. The soldiers I observed this week achieved performance levels that appear to be substantially higher than historical averages for this facility." Martinez straightened in his chair, clearly preparing to defend his methods and leadership. "Ma'am, temporary improvements achieved through intensive individual attention don't necessarily indicate that unconventional methods are superior to proven military training protocol." "That might be true," Hayes replied, "except that I've also reviewed historical performance data, failure rates, and student feedback from the past 3 years. What I found suggests that traditional methods at Fort Harrison have been producing consistent failure rates that are significantly higher than comparable facilities." The room fell silent as the implications of that statement set. Martinez had built his reputation on maintaining rigorous standards, but Hayes was suggesting that those standards were actually producing substandard results compared to other military training facilities. Major Stevens opened a folder filled with comparative data. "Lieutenant Colonel, Fort Harrison's marksmanship qualification rates are currently 15% below the Army average, with recycling rates that are among the highest in the training command. These statistics suggest systemic problems that go beyond individual student capabilities." Furthermore, Hayes continued, "Several soldiers I interviewed reported that they had experienced success using Instructor Chen's methods after failing repeatedly with conventional approaches. This pattern suggests that the issue isn't soldier capability, it's training effectiveness." Martinez's face had gone pale as he began to understand that his accusations against me had triggered a broader investigation into his entire program. What he'd intended as evidence of my misconduct had instead highlighted deficiencies in the system he'd spent years developing. "Colonel Hayes," he began, "I've dedicated my career to maintaining the highest standards of military training. If there are areas for improvement, I'm certainly willing to consider modifications to our protocol." "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez," Hayes replied with finality, "based on my investigation, I'm recommending immediate changes to the training program at Fort Harrison. Effective Monday, Instructor Chen will be designated as lead marksmanship instructor, with authority to implement adaptive training methods as the primary approach for all student groups." The words hit the room like incoming artillery. Martinez sat frozen, apparently unable to process that his authority was being transferred to the contractor he'd been trying to eliminate.
I felt a mixture of vindication and professional satisfaction, but also recognition that this victory came with enormous new responsibility. Furthermore, Hayes continued, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, you will be reassigned to administrative duties, pending a comprehensive review of training outcomes and management practices at this facility. Major Stevens will remain at Fort Harrison to oversee the transition and evaluate the effectiveness of the new training protocol. As Hayes concluded the meeting and dismissed the assembled officers, I realized that the confrontation Martinez had engineered to destroy my career had instead revealed systemic problems that threatened his own position. The broken rifle he'd handed me months earlier had indeed become the deadliest weapon on base, not because it could shoot more accurately, but because it had demonstrated the power of adaptive thinking over rigid adherence to failed methods. The transformation of Fort Harrison's marksmanship program began immediately, but the personal consequences of the week's events took longer to fully unfold. Martinez cleaned out his office on Friday afternoon, moving with the mechanical precision of someone whose entire worldview had been fundamentally challenged. He said nothing to me during the transition, but his silence spoke louder than any confrontation could. Major Stevens remained at Fort Harrison for 6 weeks, observing the implementation of adaptive training methods and documenting outcomes with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the Army's entire approach to marksmanship instruction might be changing based on what happened in Colorado. His presence ensured that every aspect of the new program was properly recorded and evaluated according to military standards. The soldiers who had participated in that final week of emergency training became the first graduates of what would eventually be designated the Fort Harrison Adaptive Marksmanship Program. Private Foster deployed with her unit 2 weeks later, carrying qualification scores that ranked her in the top 10% of her specialty. More importantly, she deployed with confidence in her ability to adapt and perform under whatever conditions she might encounter. Within a month, word of the program's success had spread throughout the military training community. Fort Harrison began receiving visitors from other installations, senior officers who wanted to observe adaptive training methods and evaluate their potential for broader implementation. What they found was a program that consistently produced higher qualification rates, lower recycling requirements, and soldiers who demonstrated genuine understanding of marksmanship principles rather than rote memorization of procedure. The most significant validation came 3 months later when the Army Training and Doctrine Command formally adopted adaptive training principles as the preferred methodology for marksmanship instruction across all installations. The federal program that had originally brought me to Fort Harrison was expanded and renamed, with Fort Harrison designated as the primary training facility for instructors who would implement these methods throughout the military. Colonel Hayes recommended me for the Army's Outstanding Civilian Service Award, citing not just the development of effective training techniques, but the courage to maintain professional standards despite institutional pressure. The citation specifically mentioned my willingness to prioritize soldier success over personal safety, a principle that Hayes noted exemplified the best traditions of military service. But the recognition that meant the most came from an unexpected source. 6 months after the confrontation that had transformed everything, I received a letter from Martinez, postmarked from his new assignment at a logistics command in Virginia. The letter was brief but surprisingly honest. Sarah, it began using my first name for the first time. I wanted to apologize for my behavior at Fort Harrison, and to acknowledge that you were right about adaptive training methods. I spent so many years building a system that I lost sight of the fact that the system was supposed to serve the soldiers, not the other way around. Your courage in standing up for what you knew was right forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my own priority. He went on to explain that his new assignment had given him perspective on the broader impact of training effectiveness. Soldiers who came through Fort Harrison after the program transformation were noticeably more confident and capable than those who had completed conventional training at other facilities. Unit commanders specifically requested soldiers trained in adaptive methods, recognizing their superior ability to perform under varied conditions. I don't expect forgiveness, the letter concluded, but I wanted you to know that the changes you implemented have made a real difference in military readiness. The soldiers you trained are serving with distinction, and the methods you developed are helping thousands of others achieve success they never could have reached using traditional approaches. The letter represented something I hadn't expected, genuine acknowledgement from someone who had initially seen my success as his failure. It also reflected a broader change in military culture, where innovation was beginning to be valued more than adherence to tradition for its own sake. The success of the Fort Harrison program attracted attention from civilian law enforcement agencies, who faced similar challenges in preparing officers for varied shooting conditions. I was invited to consult with police academies and federal training facilities, adapting military marksmanship principles for civilian application. The techniques that had been controversial in military circles proved highly effective in law enforcement training, where officers needed to be prepared for unpredictable scenarios with imperfect equipment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and Marcus Thompson both received promotions and new assignments that allowed them to implement adaptive training methods at other installations. Rodriguez became the senior enlisted advisor for the Army's new marksmanship training program, while Thompson was selected to establish similar programs for Special Operations Force. Their success represented the broader impact of changing how military professionals thought about effective instruction. The most rewarding development was watching soldiers who had once struggled with conventional methods become instructors themselves, teaching adaptive techniques to new students. Amanda Foster, after completing her overseas deployment with distinction, returned to Fort Harrison as a civilian contractor, bringing real-world experience to inform training development. Her transformation from struggling student to confident instructor embodied everything the program was designed to achieve. Colonel Hayes was promoted to Brigadier General and assigned to oversee military training reform across multiple branches. During her farewell ceremony at Fort Harrison, she spoke about the importance of leaders who have the courage to challenge systems that aren't working, even when that challenge carries personal risk. Military effectiveness depends on our willingness to adapt and improve, she told the assembled officers and civilians. Instructor Chen demonstrated that kind of adaptability and moral courage, and her example has made our entire military more effective. The question each of us must ask is whether we have the courage to do the right thing when it's difficult, or whether we'll choose the safe path that protects our careers at the expense of the people we're supposed to serve. Her words resonated beyond Fort Harrison, contributing to broader conversations about military leadership, institutional change, and the responsibility professionals have to challenge ineffective systems. The story of the broken rifle and the instructor who turned it into an opportunity for transformation became part of Army leadership curriculum, taught at officer and non-commissioned officer schools as an example of principled leadership under pressure. 2 years after that confrontational week in November, Fort Harrison had become the premier marksmanship training facility in the military, with a waiting list of students from all branches seeking instruction in adaptive methods. The base that had once been known for high failure rates and rigid adherence to tradition was now recognized for innovation, effectiveness, and the highest qualification rates in the training command. Emma graduated from Colorado State with degrees in engineering and business, supported by the financial stability that my success at Fort Harrison had provided. She joined a defense contractor working on advanced military training systems, bringing fresh perspective to the development of technologies that could support adaptive instruction methods. Our family's military service had come full circle, with both of us contributing to military effectiveness in our own ways. The rifle that Martinez had handed me as a test of my supposed limitations still sits in my office at Fort Harrison, now serving as a reminder of how apparent weaknesses can become sources of strength when approached with the right mindset. Students often ask about the significance of the damaged weapon displayed prominently among awards and commendations, and I use it to illustrate a fundamental principle of adaptive training. The problem isn't the equipment you're given, it's how you choose to work with. During a recent visit to Fort Harrison, Major Stevens, now a lieutenant colonel, observed that the transformation of the marksmanship program had implications beyond military training. What happened here, he noted, demonstrates that institutional change is possible when leaders have the courage to prioritize mission effectiveness over personal comfort. The principles you applied to marksmanship training, understanding individual differences, adapting to imperfect conditions, focusing on outcomes rather than procedures, those principles apply to leadership challenges throughout the military. His observation highlighted something I'd come to understand about the entire experience. The confrontation with Martinez hadn't really been about training techniques or institutional authority. It had been about two different philosophies of leadership and service. Martinez had prioritized maintaining systems that protected his position and preserved institutional stability. I had prioritized achieving outcomes that served the people depending on effective instruction. The broader lesson wasn't just about marksmanship or military training. It was about the responsibility professionals have to challenge systems that aren't working, even when that challenge carries personal risk. Every organization faces moments when individuals must choose between personal safety and institutional effectiveness, between protecting their careers and serving their mission. Looking back on that period of confrontation and uncertainty, I realized that the most important decision wasn't choosing to defy Martinez's restrictions, or continuing to use effective training methods despite threats. The most important decision was recognizing that some principles are worth defending regardless of personal consequences. The soldiers depending on effective training deserved better than methods that were designed to fail them, and they deserved instructors who would take risks to ensure their success. Today, Fort Harrison trains over 2,000 soldiers annually, with qualification rates that exceed Army standards by significant margin. Former students serve in units throughout the military, carrying skills and confidence that enable them to perform effectively under the varied conditions they encounter in real-world assignments. The broken rifle that once represented an impossible challenge has become a symbol of how apparent limitations can be transformed into opportunities for excellence. The success of adaptive training methods has attracted international attention, with Allied militaries sending officers to Fort Harrison to learn techniques they can implement in their own forces. The program that began as a federal initiative at a single installation has become a model for military training reform across multiple nations. But the impact I'm most proud of isn't measured in qualification statistics or institutional recognition. It's reflected in the confidence of soldiers who once believed they weren't capable of success, in the effectiveness of military professionals who understand their equipment and can adapt to changing conditions, and in the knowledge that standing up for what's right can create positive change that extends far beyond individual careers. The instructor who was given a broken gun and expected to fail had indeed turned it into the deadliest weapon on base, not through superior marksmanship, but through the power of refusing to accept limitations that others assumed were permanent. Sometimes the most powerful response to impossible circumstances isn't finding a way to succeed despite them, but demonstrating that the circumstances aren't actually impossible at all. Martinez was right about one thing during our final confrontation. The methods I used did require skilled instructors who understood underlying principles rather than just following procedures. But he was wrong about the implications of that requirement. Military effectiveness has always depended on developing professionals who can think through problems and adapt to changing conditions. The question isn't whether we can afford to invest in that kind of professional development, it's whether we can afford not to. The broken rifle still sits in my office, a reminder that the most dangerous weapon isn't always the one that shoots most accurately. Sometimes it's the one that forces everyone around it to reconsider what they think they know about effectiveness, adaptation, and the courage required to challenge systems that aren't serving the people they're supposed to protect. Fort Harrison continues to evolve and improve, incorporating new techniques and technologies, while maintaining the fundamental principle that brought success in the first place. Every soldier deserves instruction that gives them the best possible chance to succeed, regardless of what that requires from their instructor. That principle, more than any specific training method, represents the real transformation that began with a damaged rifle and an instructor who refused to accept failure as inevitable. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.